Hello, scholars. Mr. Long signing on. Today, we're going to be talking about the opening stages of the Cold War in the post-World War II world. We're going to start off with how the United States is coming out of World War II, some of the relationships with the United States and the Soviet Union, setting the stage for the Cold War. And we should get all the way through, at least touching on some of the basics of the Korean War. We have a lot to do, and I'm going to try to keep this as succinct as possible, so I'm not going to read off every bullet. If you need to pause slides to look over the bullets, good on you. But we're going to try to move through as quickly as possible. Let's go. So, post-war economic activities. The United States, if you recall, went into World War II with the Great Depression, so the economy was at a very low point due to government spending during the war, World War II being the most expensive war in U.S. history, as well as decreases in unemployment with so many millions of people being drafted or volunteering to go serve in the armed forces. We also have women entering the workforce, generating income and moving money around. We were the arsenal of democracy, so the Soviet Union, Great Britain, other allied nations were buying United States weapons and supplies, further boosting our economy. So going into the war, economy bad. Coming out of the war, economy great. The economy is going to continue to improve with the GI Bill. This was a congressional law that whenever veterans came back after the war, they had access to education and housing at taxpayer expense, partly as a thank you to these soldiers who served, but also as a way to give them skills that were marketable within the economy. Many of these people that came back, they were standard riflemen. U.S. doesn't need a lot of riflemen during peacetime, so they need some kind of skill. Well, let's send them to school to become accountants or welders or what have you. And using taxpayer dollars to set up these veterans with diplomas and jobs is going to further benefit the economy because now we have a more skilled workforce that is then, again, turning in the cogs of the economy. GDP is going to climb in the 1950s and plateau. This is kind of typically going to be one of the high points of United States economic history. Things are going pretty fantastic for the Americans at this time. In general, always exceptions, but in general, things are going really well. Americans are producing more goods than ever before and ever will. One of the advantages the United States faced is that our factories and infrastructure were not bombed into oblivion during the war. So the economies of Japan, Germany, Russia, France, much of their industrial output was destroyed or at least crippled during the war. The U.S. was spared this bombing due to our geographic isolation on the other side of the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. So this created us a nice little safety zone for us to have our industry protected and start cranking out supplies that other countries are then going to buy. The middle class that had been rising before the war is going to continue to rise. This is going to kind of be one of the heydays, one of the high water marks of the United States middle class. And the middle class was consumed with two main ideas. One is consumption, just consume, consume, consume. Think about the mentality coming out of the Great Depression where people had to do more with less. Now people are able to kind of splurge and treat themselves with, 2 cars in every garage, a swimming pool in the backyard, vacation homes, or even just having money and the means to go on vacation every summer. So this is really where the United States middle class has their, the high water mark of their culture. Women are also going to benefit. Many of them went to the workforce during the war, and after the war, they're going to refuse to leave. Many do, but some are going to stay in the workforce, therefore continuing the feminist movement and keeping the efforts for equal pay and equal responsibility in society, at least within the workforce, consistent throughout. United States spending for the military. You can see that during World War II, spending was at its high point. Again, it's not really going to reach that high again in our history. In the post-war peace, spending on the military is going to be very low. The lowest it's going to be between World War II and the current time. And then we're going to have a long stretch of the Cold War keeping military spending high, but we also have some high peaks with the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and Reagan building up as the Cold War comes to a close that are going to again rise or create a higher government spending on the military. Words are hard. All right. Social and cultural migration. After World War II, Americans are going to start to migrate to what we call the Sun Belt. I think my face is covering part of it, but effectively this is the southern United States, where before World War II, people were typically moving north to escape to a more hospitable climate where there was more industry. Well, after World War II, jobs are starting to be found in the South. There's more industry. There's more different kinds of technology like electronics industry in California. We have the beginnings of aerospace technology, which we're going to see a little bit with NASA, whether it's in Texas or Florida. And so jobs are going to attract people back to the South, as well as just simple comfort items. Things like air conditioning and refrigerators are going to become more common that make it more comfortable to live in hotter climates. By 1963, California is going to have a higher population than New York State. And the shift in population back to the South is going to give the South more representation in the government. Because remember, the number of representatives you have in the House is equal to your population proportionally. So as the South has a higher population, they get more representatives, which means they get more votes in the Electoral College, and people start to pay attention to the South more after World War II than they had before. If you look at the little table with the different presidents, you're going to see some southern states start to get more representation as we move through the modern era. So you get stuff like, Texas with Lyndon B. Johnson, California with Richard Nixon, a little bit of Nebraska. You get Georgia with Jimmy Carter, Arkansas with Bill Clinton, Texas with George W. Bush. You're going to have George H. Bush also coming from Texas. George H. Bush from Massachusetts and George W. Bush from Texas. So more southern states are getting representation in the federal government as a result of this migration back southwards. Growth of the suburbs. During this time period, during the Cold War, after World War II, we're going to see a increase in suburban communities outside of major cities. This is going to be enabled in large part by improvements in transportation, whether it's more cars, more highways, more subways. And commuters are going to start to live outside the city and travel to the interior of the city for work. This is characterized in some part by the phrase white flight. And this is where white Americans are going to move to the suburbs, either because they could afford to, or because just straight up racist policies are keeping African Americans and other minorities stuck in the cities because the planners of the suburban communities just refuse to sell property to African Americans. This is going to lead to some socioeconomic problems where the upper class white families that move to the suburbs take with them their tax dollars and the money they're investing in the local community. And so the communities that used to be more mixed or more gentrified start to become more African American. And with racism as it was, these communities start to suffer, something leading to some problems that we can still see today. On the maps on the left, you can see where different groups of people start to congregate in different areas, most notably with Baltimore in 1970, where you really have African-American communities in the West and the East, and white communities being more isolated in other parts of the country, or other parts of the city and suburbs. This is also going to coincide with the rise of the baby boomers, or what we just call boomers today. These are people born after World War II and the 10 years after World War II, as the United States was getting back on its feet after the Great Depression and World War II. So a little bit of the interior stuff done. Let's move to the exterior with the United States working with other nations. In February of 1945, we have the Yalta Conference. This is going to be a conference with the big three: Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. By this point, FDR is still alive. FDR is going to die later on in April or so. So Yalta Conference, we're going to have the big three. We have Poland, this is going to start to set up Europe after World War II, with ideally many of the European countries that were being liberated from Nazi Germany having free elections. The USSR is going to go back on some of these promises. This is also going to announce the creation of the United Nations. We're going to try that whole League of Nations thing again from the end of World War I and hopefully get it right this time, or at least better. And the USSR is going to promise to attack Japan after Germany is defeated, which is going to set up a little bit of the Korean War later on. Most of the promises at the Yalta Conference were more elastic and subjective. They weren't really written down and enforced with the same heavy-handedness of a big treaty, and it was more of just promises between frenemies here. In April 1945, FDR is going to pass away, and Harry S. Truman is going to take over the presidency, inheriting a bunch of the problems that FDR was trying to deal with at the same time. Chief of which was relationships with the Soviet Union. The U.S. and the USSR were already very suspicious of each other before World War II, and they're going to come out of World War II even more suspicious of each other. One of the leading causes is the economic policy of communism versus capitalism, the U.S. favoring capitalism and the Soviet Union preferring communism. This was accentuated by the, what was it called? The Archangel incident during the Russian Civil War in the 19-teens, where the United States actually sent military forces and supplies to support the Tsar during the Russian Revolution against the communists of the Soviet Union. So when the communists won and took over the country, they're going to remember that the U.S. actually fought against the communists, therefore setting up some of that paranoia already. During World War II, the USSR is going to lose 22 to 28 million people, and they rightfully claim that they contributed more to the war effort than any other allied nation. And if you look at the table on the right here, you can see what we're talking about just in sheer quantity, where the Soviet Union at the top, they have red for military deaths and orange for civilian deaths. And then you see the United States way down here, comparing our casualties to the Soviet Union, it's grotesquely one-sided. And so for us here in the United States to chant USA, USA, USA and talk about how much we won World War II, well, the Soviet Union should probably get more credit just for the sheer number of bodies that they threw into the conflict. The U.S. also refused to share nuclear secrets after the war with the Soviet Union. We provided generous reconstruction loans to our allies, but not so much to the USSR. And the USSR was paranoid of being invaded from the West because they were invaded twice during the 20th century, once by the Germans in World War I and a second time by the Germans in World War II. And so the Soviet Union is going to want to create a buffer zone between themselves and Western Europe to help deter any invasion of Russia proper from Western Europe. What to do with Germany? This is going to be another big hot button topic after World War II. First, we have to figure out what happens to the Nazi war criminals. So we're going to have the Nuremberg war crime trials. A couple of Nazis are going to be executed. Several are going to get life in prison, and that's how we're going to deal with their crimes. Germany was divided between the big four: USSR, the United States, Great Britain, and France. On the map on the left, you can see how Germany itself was divided, with Russia kind of taking the northeast, Great Britain taking the northwest, France taking the southwest, and the United States taking the southeast. Within Berlin itself, which is inlaid in the map here, so over here is Berlin. Berlin itself is also divided between the big four, which is going to cause some problems as the Cold War starts to get a little more intense. Before the Berlin airlift, the USSR starts to separate from the rest of Europe. So they're starting to divide Eastern Europe Eastern Germany away from Western Germany. The term Iron Curtain, maybe a term you've heard before or in your other classes. This is going to be coined by Winston Churchill to help describe the divide and the paranoia between Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union versus Western Europe and Great Britain, the United States, and France. The Berlin airlift, this is going to happen in Berlin. I'm not going to go into all the specifics, so it is a really cool history story if you want to get into it. Ultimately, what happened was the USSR blocked all road traffic between the Western Germans and Berlin. So the United States, Great Britain, and France, who had a chunk of Berlin, could not get resupplied by road. This is going to cause problems with lack of medicine, lack of food, and Berlin is still rebuilding itself after the war, so the Berliners aren't quite self-sufficient yet. The Allies are going to come up with a plan of ferrying supplies in by air, and over several months, they just fly planes and land the planes and drop off food and medical supplies to keep the city alive. And the political pressure and the political success of the Allies being able to feed Berlin for a prolonged period of time just by air is eventually going to force the USSR to stand down and allow road traffic to continue on the way to Berlin. So a little victory for the Western Europeans in the United States. But again, this is just an example of that tension, is how the USSR and the Allies to the West are going to be testing each other and the will of each other throughout the Cold War without actually shooting at each other. The United States and the Western Allies are going to develop a policy of containment. This is a policy where you are trying to isolate communism and keep it from spreading. Because after the World War II, various Eastern European nations start to fall to communism. We're going to see this play out very much with the Korean and Vietnam War. So the Allies are trying to keep communism contained to the USSR and Russia and keep it from spreading. One way the Allies do this is with the Truman Doctrine, where they're just going to give money to Turkey and Greece, who are trying to snuff out communist supporters within their country. So we're kind of just going to help give money and weapons to non-communist countries to keep them non-communist. We also have the Marshall Plan, which is going to give more money to other countries that reject communism. So, hey, you need to rebuild your country after the war. If you're not communist and you stay not communist, we'll just start giving you money to rebuild. So we're kind of doing a little bit of bribery here to help people stay away from communism. The USSR realizes that they're going to have a hard time competing with all the Western nations that were all teaming up against them. So they start to form their own coalition just at the same time that the United States is forming their own coalition. So we get NATO, something that still exists today, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's going to be blue here on the map. And all these countries agreed that if any one of them are attacked, that the other United Nations or the other NATO powers are going to come support themselves against the Soviet Union for potentially a World War III. The Soviet Union is going to form their own. It's called the Warsaw Pact in 1955, which effectively does the same thing. If any Warsaw Pact country is attacked by a NATO power, then all of the Warsaw Pact countries are going to come support that country and, again, kick off another world war. World rearmament. So after World War II, there was a push to de-arm different countries to, encourage peace and make it harder for us to nuke each other. But the Cold War is going to see a quick end to that, especially with the paranoia between the USSR and the United States, where they're going to enter an arms race trying to see who can get bigger and better bombs to murder each other. The draft is going to resume in the United States. It's going to be a peacetime draft. So even though we're not directly at war, people are going to be drafted to keep the military powerful enough that if we do have to go fight World War III against the Soviet Union, our military is ready. And nuclear arsenals being expanded because nukes are really good at killing people. The Red Scare, the paranoia between the United States and the USSR is not just exclusive to the different governments and militaries watching each other. This is also going to see some social paranoia with Americans seeing Soviet spies behind every lamppost and behind every bush. We have the Rosenberg trial, where the Rosenbergs were selling nuclear secrets to the USSR. We also have a Hollywood blacklist, where different people pretty much just accuse people working in Hollywood of being communist, and then those accused are unable to get jobs because of the stigma of just being accused of being communist. Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism is going to take a lot of power, where they're just going around accusing people of being communist and investigating people. And Richard Nixon also jumps on that bandwagon and becomes a pretty successful communist hunter during this time period. So, time for this Cold War to get a little hot. So, Asia and the Korean War. After World War II, South Korea and North Korea were divided. They were conquered by the Japanese before and during World War II. After the war, they're going to be separated, with the communist Soviet Union helping out the North Korea and the democratic United States helping South Korea. As the countries are trying to figure out how to reunite, whether it be communist or capitalist, neither side can make a concession to make it happen. And so eventually we're going to get North Korea try to reunite the Korean Peninsula through force. The Soviet Union isn't going to directly help out, that they are going to supply weapons to the North Koreans in the beginning, and then the Chinese are going to step in, who are communists at this time, and the United Nations gets involved to support South Korea, and you have a little bit of a World War conflict going on in Asia, though we're not going to call it a World War because it's pretty limited in its scope. Technically, the war never officially ended, as there was a ceasefire, but a peace treaty was never signed. And even to this day, you have an armed border between North and South Korea with United Nations soldiers in South Korea, just in case the war goes hot again. Whew. All right. That should have been just about 20 minutes. I'm pretty proud of myself, and I'm deathly thirsty for talking so fast. I apologize if I went too fast, but you guys have the rewind and pause button, so you guys should be good. So 3 check-on learning questions for you. First one is looking at social changes within the United States with migration to the Sun Belt and how that's going to impact the changes in politics for the United States. We're also going to be looking at some issues between the United States and the Soviet Union and how they're suspicious of each other after World War II. And finally, I want you to look at the Marshall Plan and assess how the United States used the Marshall Plan to combat the spread of communism after World War II. Whew! I am psyched after getting that done. Yeah, I need to go take a nap. That was exhausting. So you guys have some check on learning questions. Email me if you have any questions, and I will see you guys in class. Mr. Long, over and out.